It was just another ordinary afternoon in the city, one of those days where the sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden hue over the streets. Michael, a wealthy businessman, stepped out of his sleek black car, the leather of his briefcase soft under his grip. He'd spent the morning in meetings, and now he had a few hours of freedom before his next big appointment. But as he walked down the street toward his favorite cafe, something caught his eye. A little girl, no more than 12 years old, sitting on the curb with a small folding table in front of her. Her face was partially obscured by a simple sun hat, and a sign that read, "Homemade cookies for sale," rested on the table. At first, Michael thought nothing of it. There were always kids selling lemonade or cookies on the street corners. But then something about her, her quiet demeanor, the way she barely looked up as passers-by ignored her, made him pause. He stopped for a moment, looking at the small display of cookies in front of her. There was a bowl of them, some neatly arranged, others with crumbs scattered around. She seemed out of place here, not just because of her age, but because of the way she sat, shoulders slumped, staring at the ground. Michael felt a strange tug in his chest, an unease that he couldn't quite place. "Hey there," Michael said, offering a small smile as he approached. The girl slowly lifted her head to meet his gaze. Her eyes were large, dark, and filled with something he couldn't quite identify. It wasn't the usual innocence of a child. There was a quiet sadness in them. She nodded, her lips barely parting. "Hi," she said softly. "Selling cookies?" Michael asked, his tone light. She nodded again. "Yeah," she replied, almost as if she wasn't entirely sure why she was even doing it. Michael's gaze dropped to the cookies. They didn't look bad, though the packaging was simple. Just clear plastic bags tied with string. There wasn't any fancy marketing, but it was clear this little girl was trying to make a sale, and he admired her determination. He smiled again, but this time it was a little more genuine. "How much for a bag?" he asked, pulling out his wallet. She hesitated, glancing down at the cookies. $2, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He pulled out a few bills and handed them to her. As he reached for the bag, he noticed how she clutched the money in her hands tightly, as if she were afraid someone might take it from her. "You don't have to give me change," Michael said, trying to offer her a reassuring smile. "Keep it." The girl's eyes widened, and for the first time, a small flicker of hope seemed to appear in her gaze. She looked up at him, but her voice wavered as she asked, "Are you sure?" Michael nodded, his smile softening. "Of course. Keep it. You're doing a good job here." But then, as he started to walk away, something made him stop. It wasn't just the look in her eyes that had pulled at him. There was something else, something more he couldn't quite explain. He turned around and walked back to the table. "You know," he said, a thought forming in his mind, "why are you out here selling cookies by yourself? Shouldn't you be at home?" The girl stiffened at his words, her face flushing a deep red. She bit her lip, hesitating, then lowered her head. Michael waited patiently, sensing there was more to this story than she was willing to share. After a long pause, the girl spoke quietly, her voice barely audible over the city noise. "I'm trying to help my mom," she said, her words coming out in a rush, as if she needed to say them all at once. "She's sick, really sick." Michael's heart skipped a beat, and he leaned forward slightly, surprised by the sudden vulnerability in her voice. "What's wrong with your mom?" The girl's eyes flickered with sadness as she looked up at him, then quickly looked away. "She has cancer. She's been in the hospital for a while. I don't have enough money for her treatment, but I'm trying to save up for it. I thought maybe if I sold enough cookies I could help." The words hung in the air for a long moment, and Michael's mind raced. This little girl, standing here on the street, was fighting battles that no child should have to face. She wasn't just selling cookies to make a few extra dollars for a toy or a treat. She was trying to save her mother's life. He felt a lump form in his throat as he realized just how much weight this little girl was carrying, and just how little help she had. The city, with all its wealth and grandeur, seemed so distant from her reality. She was here alone, trying to juggle the impossible. Have you been able to raise enough money?" Michael asked, his voice unsteady. The girl shook her head slowly, the tears she had been fighting back starting to show in her eyes. "Number, I've only made a little bit, but I'm trying, and I'll keep trying. I have to." Michael stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say. How could words even begin to heal the situation? But then, something inside him clicked, a deep sense of empathy and responsibility taking hold. He reached into his pocket again and pulled out a thick wad of cash, more than enough to cover the cost of her cookies. But that wasn't the point. He looked at her, feeling something stir inside of him that he hadn't felt in a long time. Something beyond sympathy, something that spoke to a deeper part of his soul. "You don't have to do this alone," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I'll help you. We'll find a way to get your mom the treatment she needs." The girl's eyes widened again, her small hands shaking as she clutched the money he handed her. It was as if she couldn't fully comprehend what he was saying. "You will?" she whispered. Michael nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of what he had just promised. "Yes, you're not alone in this." As he turned to leave, he couldn't help but glance back at the girl one last time. Her expression was still one of disbelief, but there was something else, something fragile, like the first light of dawn after a long, dark night. He hoped it was hope, but he wasn't sure yet. As he walked down the street, his thoughts raced. This was just the beginning. The fight for this little girl's mother had only just started, but Michael couldn't walk away now. He had to make sure this story didn't end in tragedy. He had to make sure this girl's bravery didn't go unnoticed. The world wasn't fair, but maybe, just maybe, he could help tilt it in the right direction for once. And with that thought, he made a promise to himself, to her, that he would do whatever it took to make sure Amy's mother got the treatment she so desperately needed. Michael couldn't shake the image of the little girl from his mind as he walked back to his car. Her eyes, dark, filled with an innocent desperation, kept replaying in his thoughts. He had seen poverty before, had heard the stories of struggling families, but this was different. This wasn't just a financial struggle. This was a fight for survival, for a mother's life, waged by a child far too young to bear such responsibility. As the days passed, Michael found himself thinking about her more and more. He tried to go about his usual business, meetings, calls, the grind of his day-to-day, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw her sitting on the curb with that small table of cookies. He saw the way her hands shook as she clutched the money. He saw the quiet determination in her eyes, but also the fear, the uncertainty of what would happen if her efforts weren't enough. That weekend, Michael made a decision. He couldn't just forget about her. This wasn't a problem that could be solved with a few kind words and a cash donation. He had the means to make a real difference, and for the first time in a long time, he felt the weight of his privilege in a way that wasn't about status or wealth, but about responsibility. He spent the next few days doing everything he could to find out more about the girl, her name, where she lived, who her mother was, and the details of her situation. It wasn't easy. Amy, the girl, hadn't been very forthcoming when he had asked her about her family, and she hadn't provided any contact information. But Michael was persistent. He called a few local charities, searched for hospitals in the area, and even spoke to the cafe owner he had passed by that day, hoping for a lead. Finally, after a few days of research, he tracked down the address. It wasn't far from where he had seen Amy that afternoon. He learned that her mother, Sarah, had been battling cancer for months now. The treatments were expensive, and despite their best efforts, they had fallen behind on medical bills. It was heartbreaking, a single mother trying to do everything she could to save her daughter, and her daughter, just a child, doing everything she could to save her mother. One afternoon, Michael drove over to the small apartment building on the outskirts of the city, feeling a tightness in his chest. He had no real plan other than to meet the mother and see what he could do to help. When he arrived, he took a deep breath before walking up to the door. It wasn't grand or even particularly well kept, but it was home to them. He knocked twice, and a soft voice answered from inside. "Yes?" The voice sounded weary, like someone who hadn't had a good night's sleep in far too long. "Hi," Michael said, trying to sound reassuring. "I'm Michael Stevens. I met your daughter Amy a few days ago. She was selling cookies on the street. I wanted to talk to you about her, about what's going on." There was a brief silence, then the door cracked open and a woman in her early 40s appeared. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow from sleepless nights, and she looked older than her years, as if the weight of her illness and the struggles of life had aged her far beyond her time. She studied him for a moment, a flicker of suspicion in her eyes, before stepping aside and letting him in. They sat at the small kitchen table, the faint smell of soup simmering in the air. Sarah looked at him warily, but seemed to sense he wasn't there to cause trouble. After a few moments of silence, Michael spoke again. "I know this is probably strange," he began gently, "but when I met Amy, she told me about what's been going on, about your illness. I want you to know that I'm here to help. Whatever you need. I don't want her to have to carry this burden alone." Sarah's expression shifted. She looked as if she was about to say something, but her lips trembled and her eyes welled up with tears. She looked down at the table, hands trembling as she clasped them together. "I never wanted her to have to do this," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I never wanted her to have to fight like this. She's just a little girl, and here she is, trying to raise money to save me. I'm not strong enough to fight for her anymore. She's the one who's holding us together." Michael's throat tightened as he watched her struggle to keep herself together. He wanted to say something to comfort her, but the words didn't come. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "I've already spoken to some doctors," he said quietly, his eyes focused on Sarah's. "I want to make sure you get the treatment you need. I can help with the medical bills, pay for the treatments, and get you the care you deserve." Sarah's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. You would do that? But why?" "Because I can," Michael said, the words coming easier now. "And because it's the right thing to do. You're not alone in this, Sarah. Neither of you are." Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she shook her head. "But Amy, she's just a child. She doesn't deserve this. I should be the one fighting for her, not the other way around." "I know," Michael said gently. "But right now, it's about all of you. I can't fix everything, but I can make sure you get the help you need." Sarah sat in stunned silence, her body shaking with quiet sobs. Michael sat across from her, waiting for the moment to settle. He didn't push, didn't say anything more. Sometimes it was enough just to be there, to offer a lifeline when it felt like everything was falling apart. Finally, Sarah lifted her head and looked at him, her expression weary but full of gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. "You don't know how much this means. You've given us hope, something we haven't had in a long time." As Michael left their apartment that evening, a heavy weight lifted from his chest. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time, he felt like they might just have a chance. Amy and Sarah weren't alone anymore, and for Michael, that was enough to give him hope again too. The next few weeks were a blur for Michael, filled with meetings with doctors, specialists, and insurance representatives. He spared no expense, pulling every string he could to ensure that Sarah would get the treatment she desperately needed. He arranged for transportation, scheduling visits, and coordinating all of it so that neither Sarah nor Amy would have to worry about the logistics of it all. Throughout the process, Michael kept in regular contact with Sarah. He checked in daily, often just to offer words of encouragement or ask if there was anything else they needed. He could hear the change in her voice as the days went by, the weight of her exhaustion slowly starting to lift. The treatments were tough, but they were working. There was a light, a glimmer of hope that hadn't been there before. For the first time in months, Sarah allowed herself to believe that she could survive this. Amy, too, had changed. The little girl who had once sat alone on the street, selling cookies to raise money for her mother, now seemed lighter. Her cheeks had a hint of color, her smile brighter. But even as she grew stronger, she hadn't forgotten the fight she'd fought for her mother. Michael saw it every time he visited. Her quiet determination, her gratitude, and the way she still helped care for her mother in ways only a child could. One afternoon, Michael sat in their small living room, watching Amy as she brought her mother a glass of water. Sarah, though still fragile, was stronger now, her voice more energetic, filled with gratitude and cautious optimism. "Michael," she said, her voice soft, almost tentative, "I can't thank you enough. We wouldn't have made it without you. Amy, she's so strong, but she needed someone like you, someone who could show her it wasn't all on her shoulders." Michael looked at Amy, who was sitting on the couch, her legs tucked underneath her. She was staring at him, wide-eyed as if she were still trying to process everything that had happened. Michael smiled and gave her a nod. "You've got a remarkable daughter, Sarah. I think she's taught me more about courage than I've ever known," Michael said, his voice tinged with emotion. "She saved you, and now it's my turn to help." Sarah lowered her gaze, wiping away a stray tear. "I just never thought we'd be in this situation. I never thought my little girl would have to carry this weight." She hesitated, then continued. "I should be the one looking after her, not the other way around." Michael didn't have an answer for that, but he didn't need to. The love and sacrifice between mother and daughter were already more powerful than anything he could say. But things weren't perfect. The emotional strain on Amy and Sarah was still present. There were still moments of quiet desperation, long nights where fear crept back in. The road to recovery wasn't straight, but Michael had become a constant in their lives, someone who reminded them that hope could always be found, even in the darkest times. A few weeks after Sarah started her treatments, Michael suggested they take a small break from everything. He offered to take them out for a meal, something light-hearted to bring a sense of normalcy back into their lives. It had been a while since they'd laughed, since they'd had time to just be together without the weight of illness hovering over them. The three of them walked into a small family-owned restaurant not far from their apartment. Amy seemed shy at first, her gaze darting around as if she was still trying to wrap her mind around everything that had changed. But as the evening wore on, she relaxed, her laughter filling the space as she and Michael exchanged jokes and stories. Sarah, too, had a soft smile on her face, a rare sight in recent months. It wasn't the grand gesture Michael had expected. There were no flashy dinners or extravagant shows of wealth. But sitting there, at that little table, in a humble corner of the city, surrounded by the soft hum of chatter and the smell of fresh bread, Michael realized that this was what mattered. It wasn't the wealth he had accumulated over the years, or the accolades he had earned. It was this, helping people when they needed it most, finding hope even when it seemed impossible. Later that evening, as they walked back to their apartment, Amy took Michael's hand. Her small fingers wrapped around his with surprising strength, and she looked up at him with those deep, grateful eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with sincerity. "Thank you for saving my mom." Michael's heart swelled with emotion. He bent down to meet her gaze, holding her hand gently in his. "You don't have to thank me, Amy," he said softly. "You're the one who saved her. I just made sure you both had the chance to fight." Amy smiled up at him, her eyes sparkling with gratitude. "Well, if you didn't help, I wouldn't have had the chance." For the first time in what felt like forever, Michael let himself believe that everything was going to be okay. Sarah's treatment was working. Amy was smiling again. And in this quiet, unassuming way, they were a family once more, stronger than ever. As they reached the door to their apartment, Sarah turned to Michael with a soft smile. "You've given us a second chance at life. I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done." Michael shook his head, his eyes filled with emotion. "All I've done is remind you that the fight isn't over. You've done the hard part." It was a simple statement, but the weight of it hung in the air. The fight wasn't over, but with hope, support, and the kind of love that doesn't give up, maybe they had already won. As the weeks went by, life began to settle into a new routine for Sarah and Amy. The daily battles against fear and uncertainty had become less frequent, replaced by a sense of cautious hope. Sarah's health was improving, though slowly, and Amy had returned to school, her spirit no longer burdened by the constant worry over her mother's condition. There were still tough days, moments of exhaustion when it felt like the world was pressing in, but they had each other, and Michael had shown them that they were not alone. Michael, too, had changed. Before meeting Sarah and Amy, his life had been full of business meetings, press conferences, and high-profile events. He had never given much thought to what lay behind the smiles of the people he saw every day. Their struggles, their pain, their stories. But through Sarah and Amy, he had learned what it meant to fight for something that mattered, to be truly present in someone else's life. And he had found a new kind of purpose. He would visit them regularly, sometimes bringing small gifts for Amy, other times simply sitting and talking with Sarah. But what he treasured most were the moments when they didn't talk at all, when they sat together in the quiet of the evening, sharing the comfort of each other's presence. It wasn't always about fixing things, it was about being there when it mattered most. One Saturday afternoon, Michael stood outside their apartment building, waiting for Amy and Sarah. He had planned a little surprise for them, a small celebration of the progress they had made together. He didn't want to make a big deal out of it, but he thought they deserved something to mark this new chapter in their lives. When they arrived, Sarah smiled at the sight of Michael standing there with a bouquet of flowers in his hands. "What's all this for?" she asked, her eyes twinkling with curiosity. "I just wanted to do something special for you two," Michael replied, handing the flowers to Sarah. "You've come a long way, and it's time to celebrate that." Amy's face lit up as she looked at the flowers, then at Michael. "We are really going to celebrate?" she asked, as though the very idea of celebration was something distant, something that hadn't been part of their world for a long time. "Yes, we are," Michael said, bending down to her level. "You've earned it." They all went inside, and for the first time in a long while, they sat down to a meal that wasn't about survival, but about joy. Laughter filled the room, simple and pure. It wasn't a grand banquet, but it didn't need to be. There was something so profound about that moment, the realization that the fight wasn't over, but it was no longer a fight for survival. It was a fight for a better future, and they were winning. Later that evening, after the dishes were cleared away, Michael sat on the couch, his thoughts turning inward. He had watched Amy grow stronger over the past few months, more confident, more open, but even more than that, he had seen the way Sarah had found new strength. She had been broken, yes, but in her vulnerability, she had discovered a kind of resilience that was both humbling and inspiring. As the evening wound down, Sarah sat next to him, her eyes soft, but filled with gratitude. I don't know how to thank you for everything, she said, her voice filled with sincerity. You don't have to thank me, Michael replied, his voice low but steady. You both gave me something I never expected, a reason to fight for something beyond myself. It's an honor to be here with you. Amy, who had been sitting quietly nearby, suddenly spoke up. Michael, do you think we'll be okay now? I mean, really okay? Michael turned to her, his heart swelling at the question. It was a simple question, but it carried so much weight. He reached out and took her hand in his. I think you've already proven that you are, he said softly. And with your mom's strength, you'll only get stronger. Sarah looked at Amy, her eyes misting over. We're going to be okay, she whispered, as if confirming the words she had been afraid to say aloud until now. We have each other, and now we have hope. That night, as Michael prepared to leave, Amy hugged him tightly. Thank you, she whispered again, this time without the need for further explanation. The gratitude was in her heart, clear as day. Michael smiled and hugged her back, feeling a weight lift from his own chest. Take care of each other, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I'll always be around if you need me. And with that, he left their apartment, his heart full, knowing that they had made it through the darkest moments. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, there would be more challenges, more obstacles to overcome. But they had found something more valuable than any material wealth, the power of compassion, of kindness, of human connection. Months passed, and Sarah's health continued to improve. Amy thrived, no longer just a little girl selling cookies on the street, but a young woman with dreams of her own. And Michael? He never forgot the lesson Sarah and Amy had taught him, that sometimes the greatest wealth in life is not measured in dollars or possessions, but in the ability to give and receive love. In a world where so much can feel uncertain, their story became a testament to the fact that even in the darkest of times, hope can be found in the most unexpected places. Stories of Hope invites you to believe in the power of compassion and to remember that it is never too late to make a difference. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to subscribe and like the video for more heartwarming stories of real-life courage and transformation.